Welcome to the HUNET HRD Leaders Forum. My name is Josh Burson. I'm excited to be able to keynote this conference on the age of workflow learning, and I look forward to coming to Korea and meeting many of you in person soon. This is my first time working through HUNET, and I really am excited about supporting you. I know you have an incredible company and a lot of interesting opportunities and offerings to your customers. I hope my presentation will help you understand what's going on in the world of workflow learning and really get some perspectives on how to create great learning solutions for your organization. Thank you. I'm going to start with a little bit of context setting about what's going on in learning. And the first is learning, as you all know, and in Korea, I'm sure you're seeing this as much as anywhere else, is becoming one of the most essential tools we have to drive growth as the economy stumbles. We are in a high inflation, slowing growth environment all over the world, but yet business transformation is happening faster than ever. So your ability to deliver learning and really deliver capabilities and understand capabilities is becoming really the key to growth and business success, not just part of training. And that's changed a lot in the last year. In fact, it is part of the real issue that's going on in the workforce is this mismatch between what leaders want and what employees believe. And whether you guys experience it, particularly in Korea, as we do in the United States and most other countries, employees are pretty overwhelmed. Most of the research shows that 81 to 82% of employees feel like they're burned out. 87% believe they're highly productive. Most employees feel like they're doing about as much work as they can, yet the leaders don't. And that's not because the leaders don't believe people are working hard enough. It's because leaders want our workforce to focus on the right areas, the right solutions, the right problems. And the traditional approach to learning, of course, years ago, was that you would stop what you were doing and you would go to or participate in a learning program for a week or a few days, or maybe a day, and you'd come back to work later. That just doesn't work anymore because people are so busy. It's still needed and it's still valuable, but we can't do it very often, especially in the pandemic when people are afraid to travel. So this is going to continue to be an issue as the economy grows. And it's going to be both a retention engagement and a training opportunity, because one of the most engaging things people do at work is learn or advance or grow or progress. And the turnover rate and the quit rate in most countries, this is the US, is high. Part of that is because the economy has grown for so long, and part of that is because people are tired and they're looking for something else to do. Okay, so let me skip some of this economic stuff. We can talk about that later. But there's good reasons why all this learning is needed. And the primary reason is that industries, companies, technologies are transforming. And so in a tight labor market, in a growing economy, in a inflationary environment, if we can't reskill people, we can't always replace them. Nor do we want to replace them, because they have a lot of embedded knowledge about our companies that we want to keep. Now, I've been doing a lot of research on this for many years, and let me highlight, the book that's coming out in 2 weeks, and I encourage you to buy it, because this book really summarizes about 10 years of research that I've done in 7 principles. And I won't go through them right here. We're going to talk a lot more about them later in the next month. But one of them is growth, not promotion. In other words, individuals in most companies used to learn to get promoted. There was a lot of emphasis for many years on succession management, hierarchical progression up what used to be called the leadership pipeline. Ram Charan wrote the book on that. And, the need to move up from level to level in the company. As we talk more about learning and we talk about workflow learning and we talk about talent marketplaces, you'll see that's not as necessary, not as needed. So this book is a great way for you as an individual, you as a company, to get to know and talk about these topics. It's available on Amazon. It's officially launching next week on Kindle, 2 weeks later on print. It's a beautiful book. I actually have a copy of it here if you want to see it. I guess the Zoom thing's not really showing it. There it is. But I think it sets the context for what we're going to talk about next, which is workflow learning and how it all means. Now, before I get into workflow learning, let me explain to you why workflow learning matters. And the reason is that if you look at the factors that contribute to high performance, engagement, productivity, innovation inside companies, there's a whole bunch of things you can do. You can do all of these things. And we've surveyed more than 1,000 companies and we've looked at all of them, and they all look like good things to do. But what you find when you actually look at the impact of them is the things that matter the most to drive growth in the organization and the individuals in the organization have to do with safety, inclusion, trust, belonging, and development, and understanding the priorities of their work. And so when we talk about learning, learning is one of the best employee engagement solutions you have. I've always, found in all the studies I've done of learning and looked at the ROI of learning, the book I wrote on learning measurement and many other things, that, as much as we want to build capabilities and skills and deep strength in people's job performance, they actually get very engaged from learning. It's a chance to take a step back from the day-to-day job and think about work differently. And it has many, many intangible benefits, to say nothing of the financial benefits. Even if you look at you as a company, if you look at you as a manager, if you look at you as a country, if you look at you as an individual, your ability to learn defines your success. I think in my case, in my mid-60s, if I look back on my career, I'm doing things now that I never did before. I'm doing things this year that I certainly didn't do last year. My ability to learn continuously is the only thing that I have that makes me successful in my career. And that's true for most of us and most people. So the question is, how do we do it? And we've been through quite a journey over the last 2 or 3 decades, going back to the very beginnings of digital learning, online learning. When I first got involved in this, we used to think that instructor-led learning on the web was digital learning, but it wasn't. It was a slightly more scalable, less costly way to do instructor-led learning. It worked, but it wasn't as good as instructor-led learning in a classroom, but it was cheaper, so more people could participate. And so we came up with the concept of blended learning. Maybe we should do some self-studying, some self-study, some simulation, occasionally maybe a check-in with a manager, and then a course online, coupled with other flows like that. And I wrote a book on blended learning in the early 2000s that looked at all sorts of models of that. And that was a good move from the original page-turning e-learning. And then came along talent management. In the early 2000s, 2005, 2006, companies said, well, what's the point of doing all this learning if we don't know what the job is and we don't know what the capabilities and competencies are we're trying to build? So let's take the learning programs and align them to the competencies of the job. That actually created kind of a mess because most jobs didn't have good competency models around them. And as we now know, the competency models in jobs change so fast that you're rarely going to keep them static, but we need some framework for aligning the learning. And so there was a lot of focus on talent management and the LMS, and the LMS became very, very strategic. It was the hot part of the learning industry in the mid to early 2000s, and I'm sure you all have LMSs. But then something else happened. YouTube, Google, Twitter, social networks, and all of a sudden people thought, and by the way, the most important thing of all was this thing, which I will put in front of my shirt so you can see it. Apple decided to obsolete Flash and put video on the phone. And all of a sudden we had video everywhere. And we said, wow, well, maybe all this formally designed, complex, expensive training is a little bit overkill. We should just do videos. And let's create short videos, long videos, highly qualified, carefully designed videos, or maybe videos that aren't that carefully designed, that are just videos of people talking about problems they solved and how they solve them. And that just exploded. And the companies left their corporate LMS environment and they just went on the internet. And many employees rated their learning platforms as a negative net promoter at that point in time, 2007, 2008. We did a study and the net promoter score of corporate training was negative. And they were going out to YouTube, and that gave birth to the LXP, which I'll talk about in a minute. The LXP originally was a very simple platform designed to be a discovery system to find things. So it was really like a portal. It didn't have learning delivery software in it. It really didn't deliver anything. It was really just a search engine with a nice framework, and you could tag things and arrange them and put them into paths. But it was very revolutionary. And then we came up with this idea of learning in the flow of work, which I'll show you about. Learning in flow of work was something that I think popularized. I wasn't the first one to use the term, but because I came up with some models on how it works, which I'm going to show you, which gave growth to something new, which was skills-based learning, and that's where we are today. So we've been through a big journey to get here, but the problem hasn't changed. The problem is, how do we get individuals who are busy to learn what they need to know as fast as they possibly can in an engaging way and stick with it so they learn over time and build deeper and deeper capabilities. And this idea of a capability academy is really the latest idea behind this, which is the way I call it. So we just finished a big study of corporate training done by Nahal Nangia, our director of research in the L&D area, and surveyed 1,000, 1,500 companies, got all sorts of data back on what they're doing and what's working and what's not working. And this is what we found. What we basically found is, while there's much innovation and creativity needed in the L&D community, in the L&D industry, we also need content that drives growth. It has to drive growth, or it's not going to really add a lot of value. And that is why learning in the flow of work is becoming more and more important and more aligned to talent marketplace, internal mobility, and what we now call talent intelligence. But before I get into all that, let me just tell you what this means to L&D. In L&D, what we found across many companies is that there were 4 levels of maturity as we looked at this most recent study. By the way, this is the biggest study I've ever done in corporate training, and I've done it, I think, 7 or 8 times, so maybe 6 times. So I've done it a lot. It always comes out with slightly different drivers. And as you can see here, as you move to more online digital enabled solutions, they should be more tailored, more self-directed, and then at the top of the level, targeted towards growth. We shouldn't expect employees to figure out on their own what they need to know. We should be directing them for a purpose that benefits them as well as the company. And we know this is important because in this study, which just completed about a month ago, the companies that understand growth in the flow of work, not just learning in the flow of work, but growth in the flow of work, are significantly higher performing companies. And you can see that from this data. Okay, one of the things that comes out of this, which I'll be talking about relative to career of the talent marketplace, is this idea of a career pathway. Let's suppose you're an engineer, a marketing person, a salesperson, a logistics person, a finance person, and you want to move forward in your career. You want to do more, you want to make more money, you want to get promoted. Maybe you're tired of doing what you're doing and you'd like a slightly better job or a new job. That is what we call a pathway. A pathway is a path from point A to point B that doesn't involve a stair-steps track to that particular job family. So if you're an engineer and you become a senior engineer and then a director, engineering director, and then an engineering VP, that is a career path. A career pathway would be engineer, product manager, product advisor, consultant, back to engineering. And it turns out in medium-sized to large companies that moving around horizontally is just as valuable, if not more valuable for growth than moving vertically. Yes, there are lots and lots of specialist jobs in all sorts of companies, but they are limiting in your perspective. And so in addition to creating learning in the flow of work for a linear growth. We want to create learning in the flow of work for a pathway. Get lots and lots of examples of this. I don't know if any of you are in the healthcare industry, but we just finished a big study in healthcare. And what you find in healthcare is there's a tremendous gap in clinical roles. There's a lot of clinical roles that are very hard to hire. And we now have data that shows you can take people that work in very tactical jobs like laundry, linen, mobility, pushing people around on wheelchairs, and you can teach them to become nurses, and people can make 2 to 3 times as much money because of that. That is a learning pathway. And the way you do that is through what we call a capability academy. A capability academy, as I showed you earlier, is a place. It is not a type of content. It is a combination of content, experts, exposure, developmental assignments, tools, support that teach you the broader and broader concepts that you need to improve in this area. And we're really pushing companies to think about learning this way around the strategic capabilities that are most important to you. Every company has capabilities that are different, and not every capability is as important as every other. In some companies, and I'll talk to you more about how to do this, but we need to build these capabilities in a holistic way, and we'll get into workflow learning in a minute, but think about it as a business-driven solution with not only an L&D professional involved, but also a business leader sponsoring the capability. In the case of Comcast, it's customer service. In the case of Cemex, it's supply chain and safety. In the case of Capital One, it's digital and cloud. In the case of Kraft Heinz, it's a whole bunch of functional areas that are part of the consumer packaged goods industry that they're in. And we know these work, and we know they must be developed internally. You can't buy them off the shelf, because research shows that employees find internally developed, local, relevant, company-specific content to be 2 to 4 times more valuable than vendor content. So if you want to build an academy to teach people about safety or engineering or AI or whatever it may be, and you just buy a bunch of courses from Coursera or somebody else, you're not going to move the needle, not very far at all. It has to include your own content and your own experiences and your own experts in the education and training. And part of doing this is grouping people into groups so you have the right people going through the right learning. And I'll get into workflow learning in a minute, but one of the problems a lot of companies have is we have roles sprinkled all over the company that are similar, that all need the same development, but they're not in the same job family. And so if you build a capability academy, it gives you the freedom to decide which different jobs, which different roles, which different functional areas need to participate and consume that content. We just went through this with a big bank, and we found that they had 8 different job titles all over the bank that had to do with project management. All of these people were learning different things from different courses and going down different paths. They also had 6 different jobs that had to do with product management. You can imagine the problem that creates. It just makes it impossible to train people. So part of your job in workflow learning is bringing together the people that need to know the things you need to know. Now, what is it they need to know? Well, these days we talk about skills, not competencies. Well, let me talk a little bit about skills. So if you go back to the beginning, when I talked for the first few minutes about talent-driven learning, the idea of talent-driven learning was to align the learning to the job and the job structure around it. Now, that sounds good in principle, but it's actually pretty hard to do, because the only people who really know what is required to do that job are the people in that job. You could do performance consulting and analyze the job and figure out all of the things that drive success. And I recommend you do that, by the way. You have to do that. But it will be a never-ending project, because jobs change, technologies change, tools change, business models change. Everything's always getting a little bit better. We're getting a little more automated. So the levels of capability move up all the time. So what we want to do to decipher this question of what people need to learn is build what I call a capability model. The capability model is your company's words that describe the business capabilities that you need to be successful in that job. And it comes from your work in L&D and HR, working with the business counterparts in your company to talk about what drives success, what drives outperformance, what will make you more competitive against your partner, your peers, and where is this job going? From that information, you can derive skills. Teaching people skills does not by itself create performance. If I'm a salesperson and I take a 4-hour course in Salesforce, that does not make me a better salesperson. It simply makes me better at entering information into Salesforce. If my company has decided that the valued skill in sales is, complex problem solving, well, learning Salesforce has nothing to do with that. I'm going to need much different kinds of education to do that. So before you get too focused on skills and the hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of skills we need, focus on the capabilities. And that will make your life a lot easier and your learning will be more complete. This explains the difference between the two. And if you go through this exercise with the teams you support, you will learn a lot, they will learn a lot, and I guarantee you whatever you deliver, whatever you design, will have more value ultimately. And there's many categories of skills. This is why skills are so complex. Skill is just a word. It doesn't really mean anything. Somebody could say Microsoft Office is a skill. Somebody could say closing the books is a skill. Somebody could say designing a new part is a skill. And so you have to think about the broad capabilities and the concepts of skills that apply to your company. And the final thing I'll talk about before I get into the workflow learning and specifics is, you can't do this for every job in the company. Some jobs are fine. They're, not a problem. Things are working fine there. There's other places where there's an underperforming org operation. There's places where we're missing people and we're behind and we can't get enough people to hire. And there's places where we need to transform because we're not doing the right thing. That's where you want to spend your time focused on this. Okay, so enough on sort of skills. Let me go to workflow learning. Okay, for the sake of kind of clarity, I'm going to call it learning in the flow of work. I know you guys call it workflow learning, but I'm going to call it this. The essential problem that we have to it's much more complex than this, but to really simplify a very complicated problem is we've got two types of learning. We have small things that take a few minutes, and they don't teach you a lot of new skills, but they give you information and context and awareness, and sometimes they give you skills and they give you things you remember. And then there's what I would call macro learning, a big, hairy project or exercise or course where you really dig into something. You learn the fundamentals, you learn the basics, you learn the theory behind it, and you come out of the course or the experience really thinking about the world differently, and perhaps even with capabilities to deliver on something that you never could do before. And what you find is that in every job, there's a learning curve that follows the need for micro and macro learning. This curve, the blue one, the dark blue curve, shows the curve of a typical employee in a typical job. Steep learning curve at the beginning, plateau, a period of time where you don't learn much at all, and then an opportunity to grow where it goes back up. And if you work in a great company, it goes back up at the green rate. If you work in a company that's not paying attention, you go down the red line and you quit, or you just sort of get frustrated with your job. And if you think about the types of learning you need at different points in this, progression through your job, in the beginning, you need some pretty heavy duty stuff. There's a lot of things to learn about the company, the job, the tools, the procedures, the compliance, the team, etc. So that's a, multi-week, multimodal learning experience. And then once you get on the job, you need support from mentors and you might need some coaching, and you're going to learn little tips here and there, and you'll get better and better and better over time until you reach this plateau in which it's time for something new. You need to go through macro learning again. And that's really what this is showing you, is that over the period of time in your employee's life, they're going back and forth between the need for big things and little things. And one way to think about this is the word flow. The word flow also has a psychological definition, and it refers to the psychological sense of anxiety you have at work. And as you can see from this chart, which actually came from a source, I can't remember it came from, I think from an academic, can't remember the guy's name. But in the beginning of the job, you're in anxiety, you don't know what to do. So you're kind of out of flow. You get some learning, things are good, you're in flow. You get bored, you're out of flow again. So what we want to do with learning is we want to keep people in the flow, moving up in their level of capability, but not too much where we're suddenly doing something they don't know how to do, and not so little that they're kind of like, gosh, I'm bored with this, I've been doing it too much. And that's really what learning the flow is all about. And we've studied workflow learning in large populations of people, and what you find is that, and this is from a large IT course library company, is that about 60% of the learning that's consumed by volume is structured. About 40% is unstructured. So it's not all one or the other. You can't debate which one is more important. They're both important. What you find is that as people move up their level of expertise, they tend to need less structured learning because they have such deep domain expertise about a topic that they're really adding things to it and creating context in the T, and they're not necessarily learning something completely new. If you go through the data from this particular company's experience, and they have lots and lots of companies that use their platform, what they found is that the newer people are to a topic, a role, a skill, a technology, the more they need structured learning, the more seasoned they are, the less they need it. So workflow learning will have different purposes and different utility for people at different levels. The second thing that really matters in workflow learning or learning the flow work is remembering. I mean, let's suppose I get some great course or a video, or I take something online, or I talk to somebody and I get some really great information, and then the next day I forget it. Well, then it hasn't done me a huge amount of good. So how do we forget? How do we prevent that? Lots of research has been done that says that 20 to 30% of what you learned on day one, you lose on day two. A week later, you've lost half of it if you don't use it. So we need to find a way for people to use this content and apply it. And that gets into this idea of what is called practice, or spaced learning, or repetition. Studies have been done that show that if you learn something once, 2 weeks later, you'll remember about 28% of it. If you learn something twice or 3 times, you'll remember about half of it. If you learn the concepts behind it, you'll learn significantly more than if you learned the course without the concepts. But if you practice and retrieve the content over here on this side, kind of weird, you'll remember almost 3/4 of it. And so what we have to do in workflow learning is not just intersperse content and make it available to people. We need to revisit it. We need to remind people of it. We need to go back to it. And that, believe it or not, really works, because it forces your mind to retrieve information that's already encoded in your brain, but not widely used. If you have to come in the house every day and stick your key in the lock a particularly difficult way, and you do that day after day after day after day, pretty soon you can do it in the dark, because you've retrieved it so many times that it's become almost like a muscle. But if I've only done it once, and then I come back a year later, I don't remember how to get in the house. I forgot how that key worked. So that is exactly the same mechanism that takes place in corporate learning. So really the learning strategy has to incorporate those things and include micro and macro learning, face-to-face learning, and experiential learning, all of which are important, which is why we talk about a capability academy. Now, I know I covered a lot of material pretty quickly and it's pretty high level, but many, many examples of this all the time. Onboarding is a time when there's lots of opportunity for workflow learning. Sales professionals need workflow learning. People who work in manufacturing, in customer service. I remember doing a case study of a large customer service organization for Wells Fargo, and they built a 4-week program of structured learning in the flow of work, where people were on the phones working with customers, going back to their training manager back and forth for 4 weeks to take them down this learning curve in customer service, sales, etc. And by the way, one of the keys to this is not just content and structure, but also motivation, purpose, and support. And let me just close on that, and then I'll go through your questions. You know, all of these things I'm talking about are architectural, and you can build great programs, but they won't stick unless people use them. And the reason they use them is because they feel important. You can mandate people to go through compliance training, and they will do that, but they won't remember very much of it. They'll remember things that are important to them. And one of the things that matters in learning culture is giving people a purpose to learn that's good for them, a purpose to learn that gives them satisfaction on the left, and a purpose to learn that's good for the organization. And when you do this well and give people, which gets to the issue of the talent marketplace, which we'll talk about in a minute, you create a highly engaging, high performance learning environment. And this is an area of growth for most companies where they haven't spent enough time talking about purpose. Why are we doing this? What is the purpose of doing this? What is the value to you? What is the value to the company? What is the value to the customer? And anyway, that's kind of what that's all about. Oh, this T-shaped chart that I've jumped through essentially points out that in any learning in the flow of work implementation, there are technical skills, deep skills, and there are adjacent skills. And most successful professionals in every job have both. In fact, there's studies that have been done that show that the most successful specialists are people that have moved around horizontally and had many different jobs, because your specialization is better and more and includes more judgment when you've done things in the adjacent parts of your career. So remember, as you're building your content, to think about it as a T-shaped model. Let me go through some of your questions here. Somebody asked a question, will the LXP be integrated into the EXP? Possibly. That would certainly be a nice thing if it happened. But right now, the EXP in most companies is pretty thin. It might be a portal, or it might be a Microsoft Teams or Viva or something like that. And so the LXP is a pretty complicated piece of software underneath that. The LXP, which started out, as I said, as a very simple learning portal, now has skills inference technology in it. It helps you find content across the internet. It arranges content into different learning paths, and it stores a lot of data. And I think it's a logical conclusion that it belongs in the employee experience platform. But right now, those vendors are different. The one vendor, of course, that's crossed over that is Microsoft. If you use Microsoft Viva Learning, it is essentially integrated into Viva, and so it will appear and manifest itself in Microsoft Teams. All the other learning platforms are trying to find ways to send content, data, and messages into Teams. So I think in the next year, regardless of what LXP you have, you'll be able to use it in Teams, and eventually I think Google Workspace will probably do the same thing. Competency modeling goes back to the 1980s, 1990s. And I learned about it a bit when I first started in all this, was really an exercise to take a job title, a job description, it was written down, and break it down into a series of technical and professional and managerial competencies, write those competencies down, come up with a list of definitions of what the proficiencies are at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 1, 2, 3, and then use that competency model as a way to hire people, train people, promote people, and pay people. Sounds great. Makes a lot of sense. Logically, very, very important. Impossible to do. Because, first of all, the job competencies needed are constantly changing. So somebody has to make the decisions on what goes in there. The job scope and size is constantly changing. The technologies are competency changing. And what we found with most of those systems is that by the time you built all that out, and it often took a year or two, unless it was a highly compliance-oriented, operational-oriented job, which by the way is different, that kind of work didn't didn't stay up to date. Now, let me talk about another part of the world of business, which is the operational part of business. If you're a truck driver, if you're operating equipment, if you're an oil drilling professional, if you're a manufacturing person, if you're a nurse, that's different. Those are capabilities that have to be proven, validated, and demonstrated. You need to be certified, and that's where capability and or rather competency models continue to be used. And there are tools, some LMSs and others. There's a great tool called Kahuna that is designed specifically for that kind of work, because that's very important regulatory, compliance, safety, operational based training. But for most of us who are not in those kinds of jobs, the competency model is a great guideline, but it isn't very useful over a long period of time. So we changed the language. We didn't change the idea. The same idea is still there. And now we use the idea of capabilities and skills. Unfortunately, the market moved to skills too fast. And everybody started to think about skills before they talked about capabilities. But as I talked about earlier, your work should be focused on defining capabilities. And from that, you will determine the skills, technical and non-technical, that you need to drive success in the various parts of the company you're working in. The talent marketplace and the corporate education market. Well, they're two completely different things. Let me talk about the talent marketplace. The talent marketplace is a relatively new innovation that allows individuals inside of your company to find jobs or opportunities or projects or even tasks, if your company decides to set that up, using the support of some amount of AI. So if I'm a sales manager or salesperson in Seoul, South Korea, and I would like to move to China, maybe you wouldn't want to move to China, maybe you want to move to Hawaii and work in the Hawaiian office, and you'd like, because your family needs to move for some reason, and you'd like to see what the job is there. You don't want to quit the company and look for a new job. That's a lot of risk involved in that. But I'd like to know what's available. So if I could tell the system what my preferences are, it could recommend opportunities for me. And that's what the talent marketplace does. It's a very, very important idea. It's growing very, very fast. It unlocks all of these silos that exist in companies that prevent people from finding opportunities inside the company. And every company has all sorts of silos like that. And as these marketplaces evolve and they get better, they're pretty intelligent at figuring out, if you were doing this job, these are the skills you most likely have. And here's some jobs that are similar, but maybe a little bit higher paying, that use those skills that you might want to investigate. So you can contact those managers and talk to them. So it's a really powerful tool. The reason it fits into L&D, of course, is that it's all about growth. So taking a new assignment is a learning experience. And whether you get development before, during, or after that job, the talent marketplace is basically a growth platform. So you will be working with talent marketplace systems in your role in L&D and your role in HR. And these things are starting to come together more and more through the technology. Could you give us some advice to understanding educational measurement as well? Well, when I wrote my book on training measurement, it was called at the time, most people were talking about what was called the Kirkpatrick model, level 1, 2, 3, 4. And Kirkpatrick didn't really do much with that. It didn't really teach you much, but the idea was good. The idea was the first level of effectiveness of any training is, did the users like it? Now that might sound kind of silly, but actually it's pretty important. If they didn't like it and they didn't think it was relevant, that gets to the issue of the utility of the program. And so what I did in my book is I talked about the idea of utility. Did I learn something in this course, in this program, in this object that I can use? Not did I like it because it was fun, but is it useful? And so in the training measurement book, which I wrote in 2006 or so, it's still out there. There's a model. We have it in our research library also. By the way, any of you that want more information on this, just contact us about our research library. We have lots of interesting things you can license in terms as a corporate member. That utility is sort of the surrogate for satisfaction. Would you recommend this course, Net Promoter, to others? That's a measure of effectiveness and so forth. So those kinds of measures. Second set of measures is alignment. How quickly will I use this on the job or in my life or in my career? When did I use it last? When did I use it next? How quickly could I apply this in the job? Those are questions that will tell you a lot about the effectiveness of the learning. Of course, you can take a test and measure effectiveness from that. So certification is certainly part of this. And then the impact. If you do learning, corporate learning at least, based on a performance consulting model, before you design any program or pull together any content from any sources, you diagnose the problem you're trying to solve. Yes, we need to train people to be better at their jobs, but to what end? What part of their job are we trying to improve? What metric or problem are we trying to change? If you don't know what that is, you can have a hard time measuring the impact of the training. So long before you get into developing the content and measuring what value is, do some work on figuring out what metric will define success. Is it compliance, in which case it simply is completion and certification of tests? Is it quality of work? Is it sales productivity? Is it retention? Is it promotion? Is it reducing work grievances? You can come up with all these ideas. I've got a list of hundreds of them, and figure out which one of those apply, and set yourself a goal at the beginning with your business customers. How much of this problem do we want to address here? And if he or she says, well, I want you to improve it by 50%, you have to be reasonable with them and say, well, I don't know if training can do that much, but it can certainly have an impact. And then go back and measure that metric again at the end in the same group of people before and after. That's a really good way of measuring effectiveness. Well, I think I've mentioned most of them, but I think there's one more I'm just going to talk about, and that is what I call talent intelligence. For those of you that are in bigger companies or you have larger constituent organizations, there's a lot of information inside your company about what people need to know, what people need to do, where our company is going. And I think L&D should be aware of that data. You have to be a little smarter than the average manager. You need to know what problems the company is trying to solve, who's being hired by the recruiting department, what are the new technologies, the new industry changes going on in your business area, so you can push people into the future in the right direction. And I think, read about what we've said on talent intelligence and you'll learn a lot more. Everyone, I hope this presentation was helpful in understanding workflow learning in a very tumultuous economic time. And I think this will be a period of time that'll probably go on through next year, but things will get easier. And if there's anything I've learned, is that investment in learning and taking care of employees during complex economic times is the most important strategy you have. I look forward to coming to Korea and meeting many of you in person, and thank you for inviting me to the HUNET Forum.